Good morning, Columbia. My name is Adam Brown, and I am the program director of the Science of Learning Research Initiative, which we call SOLER, because we think that name lends a certain quasi-francophone elegance, which we like. And I'm coming to you live this morning from CTL Studios in beautiful Butler Library. And those of you in the audience probably don't know very much about SOLER, but you're going to learn all about it today as we present 3 different stories about the initiative from the perspective of a faculty member who's on the advisory committee, a faculty member who has worked with SOLER doing research related to their own school, department, and course, and a student who is involved in a SOLER research project. And like I said, you're going to learn all about SOLER today, but I will first tell you a little bit about what SOLER is not, and that is that SOLER is not part of the CTL. The reason I'm saying this is just because I want to say thank you to the CTL for putting on this wonderful event and for being so generous and welcoming to bring SOLER and me and our panelists into the process today to get to share our story. So without further ado, we'll go to our first panelist, Professor Janet Metcalfe from the psychology department, who is also the director of graduate studies in that department. And she's going to tell you a little bit about the big picture of SOLER. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Adam. So the Center for Teaching and Learning promotes empirically based best practices. SOLER, however, is designed to let people discover, let faculty and students at Columbia discover how people learn and formulate and test methodologies to turn the discoveries into effective teaching and learning practice. I'm going to tell you about this from the perspective of things that are done in my lab, because it gives me a good example. My lab studies curiosity. And curiosity, as you know, is something we'd like to instill in our students and is thought to enhance learning. In my lab, we've been looking at 2 faces of curiosity. We think that there are 2 constructs, in fact, which we call curiosity 1 and curiosity 2, and that these are different. And that's a testable hypothesis, and we can look at how those relate to learning. So let's talk about curiosity 1 first. Curiosity 1 is kind of curiosity when there's a question and the person wants to know the answer. So the Oxford English Dictionary says curiosity is a strong desire to know or learn something. The questions of a particular kind provoke a feeling state that we call curiosity 1. And I'll give you an everyday example. Suppose I ask you the question, in what state is the Statue of Liberty? Well, you maybe have an idea that you know, but maybe you're a little uncertain about that. So you look at the map, and here's a map of how to get to the Statue of Liberty. And then you notice something funny, and that is that the boundary between New Jersey and New York isn't quite where you think it is. The Statue of Liberty is on the New Jersey side of the boundary, and maybe you thought the Statue of Liberty was in New York. Now you start to become curious because your certainty is unsettled. So you say New Jersey, but then you notice that when you looked it up, it was located in New York. So how can that be? So you look more closely, and what you see is that there's a boundary, and the boundary includes this little island. You might then go on to look it up and learn that there have been disputes over hundreds of years between New York and New Jersey on just this issue, that there are various treaties that have been signed. The treaties have been renegotiated. There's an ongoing battle. Your curiosity 1 has been stimulated. So what kind of question is it that provokes curiosity 1? If we knew that, we'd be in a position to provoke it in the classroom. And maybe, this is an empirical question, stimulate student learning. So we propose that there's a region that we call the region of proximal learning, which is where you almost know the answer. And if you can get materials into this region for your students, they're going to be curious about it. So if we look at people's metacognitive judgments of how much they know, from know almost nothing and don't care is what we think, to know quite a lot and almost know the answer, we think the region of proximal learning for curiosity 1 is here, close to the boundary of being mastered. There are different kinds of items that we can look at. We can look at high confidence errors. Suppose you think you're right, but then you find out that you're wrong. Well, you know a lot about items like that. Suppose an item is on the tip of your tongue. We know a lot about things that are on the tip of the tongue. We know the first letter. We know many, many things. Suppose you have a common misconception. Once you find out you're wrong, you might be very curious to know. When we look at items that are high confidence errors, for example, what we find is that we can do brain evaluations of EEG, and we find that there's a marker. When you're in this state, this late slow wave potential is higher. And that slow wave, exacerbated slow wave potential is associated with enhanced learning. People learn better when they were curious about the answer, and you can study that empirically. When they're in a tip of the tongue state, you can ask them how curious you are. And the black bars here show that they're about twice as curious to know the answer as compared to when they're not in a tip of the tongue state in this region of proximal learning. And again, you see this enhanced late positivity brain potential. If you had this kind of lab data, you could go to Adam at SOLER and have a research project in mind. And he would help you, and SOLER would help you. He'd give you seed money with almost anything along these lines. And he'd help you with the various stages of planning to turn this into a rigorous design. He might even be able to help you by getting an expert statistician to help you with the nitty-gritty of how to analyze so that you've got a real research study. And you might even be able to turn this into a full-scale government grant that you could do the research on a large scale. And Adam will help you, and SOLER will help you with that too. But you don't have to come to SOLER through the psychological research route. You might just have observed something that seems to be working in your classroom. For example, there's a professor, brilliant intuitive professor named Dr. Mary, okay? And the standard advice for giving a lecture is you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. But she didn't like that. What she did was set up a method where she would ask them to give the answer to a whole variety of questions that have common answers that everybody thinks that they're the same, okay? So it's sort of well-established but false knowledge. And what she would do would be ask her students about this and then say, no, actually the research says that this is not correct. And this stimulated their curiosity. If she wanted to test that, she could also go to Adam. So Dr. Mary would be a perfect person to bring her research or her idea to Adam. Okay, so far I've talked about curiosity 1. What about curiosity 2? We're proposing there's another kind of curiosity here. Curiosity 2, unlike curiosity 1, is not goal-driven to find the answer to specific questions. Instead, it's based on our impulse to acquire knowledge for its own sake, and it's related to exploration and to play. So this is perhaps best understood by thinking of people, famous people, who typified this kind of curiosity. And I have 2 favorites I'll tell you about briefly. The first is Odysseus. I mean, Odysseus, after they won the Trojan War, Odysseus wanted to go home, right? Ostensibly, he had a goal to get back to Ithaca and to Penelope, who was faithfully waiting for him. It's about 565 nautical miles from Troy to Ithaca. That's a week or two, or maybe even a month or two. It took him 10 years to get back. And he was curious. So adventure after adventure. The Cyclops, the Lotus Eaters, he got delayed there for a while. And of course, the beautiful Calypso. So 10 years later, after indulging in curiosity too, he finally got back to Ithaca, and he didn't stay very long there either, the truth be told. So you could say perhaps curiosity too is dysfunctional. However, the story is awesome. And maybe it's the story that counts. And not to forget, Odysseus was the one who came up with the Trojan horse, okay? So this kind of curiosity for its own sake, we think is very valuable. And then there was Leonardo. He never finished anything, including the Last Supper. It was all about changing the course of the Arno, or building a flying machine, or endless studies of anatomy, astronomy, alchemy, perspective. He actually got that right, or pretty close to right. He made a robot, he made cannons, he had a bowed piano. It went on and on. Schuh and Schultz, two psychologists, suggest that despite many proposed benefits for play, or what we here call curiosity too, and the kinds of benefits we can imagine are that it's going to enhance later learning, it practices skills that you'll need, you get better grades in school, it develops physical skills, it advertises the person's fitness, that they can afford to do it. It improves social bonding. It helps to develop cognitive maps. It improves causal perception and learning. But they say the most likely possibility is that at the moment, at least, it has no function at all. But you never know. So to conclude, I would like to urge you to engage your curiosity too about teaching and learning. And then when you do, go see Adam at SOLER. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Metcalfe. And I imagine that presentation did not answer all of your questions about SOLER, but that's okay, because as Professor Metcalfe said, now you're curious, and now we're going to learn more. So we're going to pass it on next to Dr. Beth Barron, who's an associate professor at the Columbia University Medical School. And Dr. Barron also does a lot of other interesting things involved in the medical school curriculum, and is also a collaborator and a recipient of a SOLER research grant. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Beth Barron.
Thanks, Adam. So the name of my presentation is Measuring and Addressing Implicit Bias in Standardized Patient Assessments of Medical Students. Side note of how I got to have the privilege of working with SOLER. So who am I? My roles at the medical school are I run the care committee, and this is a committee that oversees the development of clinical skills throughout the curriculum. And I'm also the associate director for the medical school simulation center. The school has a goal of creating a longitudinal assessment system that's able to measure students' progress in skill acquisition throughout all phases of the curriculum, with the goal of making sure that they're ready to practice medicine independently upon graduation. And this goal is highly dependent on having valid and reliable assessment data. So part of that assessment data comes from our simulation center. Here are some pictures from our center. You can see the rooms are designed to look like basic clinical rooms. They're equipped with video recording and audio recording. We train standardized patients to portray cases. So they're come to the center pretending to have chest pain, They're told what their symptoms are. They're told what their affect is. They're given some communication challenges to make the interview more difficult for the students. The students come to the center to interview and provide physical examinations and write notes that summarize their clinical impressions and medical reasoning. We use assessment rubrics to grade the students' performance. The standardized patients complete assessment rubrics on communication skills. You can see that on the left hand of your screen. They think about things, whether the students use multiple open-ended questions, whether they're allowed to speak, whether the student avoids using medical jargon. And they also complete checklists on physical exam skills. Were their hands washed before they touched and after they touched the patient? Did they listen to the heart in all of the right locations? The notes are graded with assessment rubrics by faculty members. So they submit notes and the faculty members read through the notes to see if the information we think should be present in the notes is there, as well as do we think that the students came up with reasonable assessments, kind of guesses on what the differential diagnosis could be. And we use this data to review our students and think about their progression. So first step is admitting you have a problem. These assessments are called objective structured clinical exams, but we began to wonder how objective these assessments really were. We were training our standardized patients both in portrayal and assessment, but we were seeing problems. We were seeing variability in portrayal. So some of the standardized patients were just maybe nicer or easier patients, more forthcoming with information. You know, they're humans, they're not robots. So there was some variability that we were wondering about. And we were noticing that a higher number of men and people of color were falling into the lowest grading threshold. And we were curious and concerned about that. And we saw this pattern was present not just in the subjective, like the standardized patient assessments of like communication skills, but also the seemingly more objective assessments, including the note grading rubrics. So the next step was to start assembling the dream team. We knew there was a problem, weren't really sure how we were going to fix it. We started by talking to colleagues that have a focus in anti-racism, both here and at Teachers College. I'll introduce you to those at the end, and started talking with them and thinking and brainstorming possible solutions and possible interventions. Together, we applied for the CTL supported Provost Teaching and Learning Large Scale Grant, which we were awarded. The medical school is very supportive of this as well, back to my original premise that they really do need to have valid, reliable data. We did a brief literature search and we saw that there was actually very little documentation of this problem, and no solutions had been offered to this problem as of yet. And I knew from talking to my colleagues at other centers that people were starting to think and worry about this at other centers. So we started working with CTL and we started to really circle on two issues. One is, how are we actually going to know that what we've brainstormed as a solution was going to work? And also that this wasn't just a VP&S problem. This was a problem that it would benefit the greater community if we were able to find a solution and share a solution. And that's where SOLER was pulled in. CTL encouraged us to apply for a SOLER grant and to really encourage us to start thinking about this from a research lens. And SOLER has been really amazing addition to our team. They have really encouraged us to be rigorous and evidence-based in our approach. We've started with an in-depth literature search, both of the extent of the problem, pushing us to think about the problem beyond standardized patients, bias in general patient encounters, in other fields of business and et cetera, and psychology. They pushed us to do an evidence-based review of interventions that have worked. Now, there weren't many in the standardized patient literature, as I discussed, but there have been interventions in both for medical students, medical faculty, and businesses outside of medicine. They pushed us to do a retrospective analysis of our archive data to really kind of hone in and understand this bias in a deeper way. How is the race and gender of the standardized patients affecting this? How is the intersection of the standardized patient and the student's race and gender, how is that impacting and causing this bias to occur? They asked us to apply some principles of cognitive and social psychology to really think about designing this prospective experimental study and this anti-implicit bias training intervention. So what does our process look like? There are multiple small meetings. There's a core team, which is myself, our lead from CTL, Ashley Kingan, and from SOLER, Adam Brown. We meet quite frequently. We have been the leads in developing the IRB protocol and brainstorming questions that we bring to the greater group where we get stuck. The graduate students that work with Adam have been instrumental in working on our literature review and doing report outs from the literature review that have helped guided some of our questions as well. We pulled together as a larger group with our anti-racism experts in CTL to bounce these questions off of, as well as they are the ones that are focusing on the intervention development. The SIM Center is involved, anti-racism experts are involved, our graduate students are involved. These are intermittent meetings where we kind of pull all of our questions together. And we think about other experts that we can pull in to get additional guidance. So here's our team. Jean Marie Alvarez Bradford, Hetty Cunningham, and Nicole Furlong and Pran Saha are anti-racism experts that have acted in this field for many years and have been instrumental in our thinking of our approach. You know who Adam is. He's instrumental in our research and IRB. Zainab, Bayung, and John are our graduate students who have been instrumental in our helping us think through our research questions, as well as helping with our literature search. And Ashley has been instrumental from CTL in pulling us all together, keeping us on track, organizing us, and facilitating the development of our intervention. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Barron. As we discussed so far, the SOLER is separate from the CTL, but we can also collaborate. And you saw from that story, the amazing potential of what can happen when CTL and SOLER work together with faculty on these types of research and pedagogy development projects. So we're going to move on now to our final panelist. Very pleased to have this person with us today. Arya Rao is a senior at Columbia College, and she was a student in a course that was connected to a SOLER grant, Brent Stockwell's Introductory Biochemistry course a couple of years ago. And subsequently, Arya got to be a TA in that same course and got to work directly with the focus of the SOLER research project. So I'll turn it over now to Arya.
All right, thank you so much, Adam. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Yeah, so welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Like Adam mentioned, my name is Arya Rao. I'm a TA in the Department of Biological Sciences for our Biochemistry 1 course, which is typically taken by 3rd and 4th year students in the college. And a brief overview of what we do, the course explores the basic biochemistry of living systems. And in particular, since a lot of the students are going into medical fields, we try to think about how the knowledge learned in the course can be harnessed to create new medicines. You know, we learn about how living systems can convert the resources within them into energy via the processes of metabolism, how that energy and these materials build the molecules that are required for the diverse functions of life. And so to generate that understanding, we go through a lot of different examples. We talk about neurodegeneration, we talk about cancer, we talk about even the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And what that involves in practice is looking really deeply at molecular structures and how they interact with different things in the body. The approach that Professor Stockwell has taken in the past couple of years is to utilize virtual reality, VR technology, to get that job done. Using these Oculus Quest 2 headsets pictured on the screen, students can really take these molecules into their own hands, turn them around, look at them from different angles, zoom in, zoom out, and see how these molecular interactions really do correspond to the functions that these molecules undertake. A little bit more about my journey through the course. Back in fall 2020, as Adam mentioned, I was actually a student myself. This was during the COVID times, and so I took the course on Zoom. And the initial VR trials were going on at this time. They were taking a couple students, not a huge bunch, and comparing them to how the students in the normal Zoom cohort did. And in summer 2021, that same trial was going on, funded through SOLER. Some students are in a VR cohort, some students are in a Zoom cohort. And so both students were attending these lectures for the entire course in Zoom. And then the VR students were attending recitations, discussion sections to look at these molecules in depth in VR or in Zoom. And after those first two VR trials in fall 2020 and then in summer 2021, we became pretty convinced that this is something that works. And so in fall 2022, last semester, we launched the first actual recitations for this course, led by TAs who have these VR headsets, students who have these VR headsets, doing recitations in VR. And we had a couple VR recitations and a couple in-person recitations. So having sat in this chair of the student and having been in the chair of TA, I have a pretty different view on what I think students should be taking away from a course. And in particular, as a student, I'm looking for two things when I start a course. One, am I learning things? Do I feel like I understand the material? Do I feel like I can manipulate it in different ways? Do I feel like it's not just going in one ear and out the other? And the other thing is engagement. I can learn the material on my own. Most students here at Columbia can. We can read a textbook and we can get what we need to know from the book, from the words on the page. And that's all well and good. But I really want to be excited to come to class. I want to look forward to the discussions I have in class, think of something new that I hadn't thought of before. I want to be engaged. And so learning and engagement together for me are the things that translate into being able to apply that material down the line in a new situation to really show that I have an understanding of what's going on. I think VR is a really great way to accomplish both of those goals, learning and engagement. And I'll try in the next few minutes to tell you why. So we'll first start with this idea of learning. From the seat of a biology student, I found that there are sort of two extremes of how biology is taught. On one end, you have memorization, which in practice looks like on an exam, you have 20 proteins, tell me the functions of all these proteins, or tell me the names, that sort of thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea of understanding. You don't need to know the names of all the 20 proteins, you don't need to know their exact functions, but can you design an experiment where you can figure out the functions of these 20 proteins, for example? And so not everything falls on one of those ends or the other. Most things are somewhere in the middle, but that is sort of the spectrum that we're working with here. So in order to illustrate how VR accomplishes this emphasis of understanding, I'd like to walk you through a little bit of introductory biochemistry here. Let's exercise these TA skills. So proteins are the instruments of biology. They work together to form the body's key structures, your tissues, your organs, and they do so at the cellular level. And that allows us to perform these basic functions that we often take for granted. Keeping cells alive, allowing your muscles to flex, allowing you to see in color, sensing when you're hungry, that sort of thing. All of that is done by proteins. But these proteins, which are so diverse, as you saw on the previous slide, they have a sort of language to them. There's a sequence of building blocks that makes up, their sequence, and those translate into the structure they form. And based on what kind of structure they have, that informs the kinds of jobs they can do. And the example I have here, you see this Y-shaped protein, that becomes an antibody. That's a molecule we're all really familiar with here in the pandemic. And so its sequence makes that structure, makes that function. That understanding is really critical for any biology you're going to do. And so when students reach this point in their undergraduate education, they've taken introductory biology. And so they understand what the proteins or the molecules are supposed to be doing. And they've taken general chemistry, they've taken organic chemistry. And so in a way, they understand what the building blocks are. And so now it's time to really learn the language. You know the letters, you know what it's supposed to say. And now it's time to really write in a way. Biochemistry has this own language. Proteins are made up of these building blocks called amino acids. You learned about these chemical structures in organic chemistry, and now you can understand why a particular amino acid in a certain spot in a protein is going to make this particular thing happen in a protein. And so the question for someone teaching biochemistry becomes, how should students learn this language? How does it work in practice? In Zoom or in person, you have students first actually learn about these building blocks and how they might work in a particular protein. You're reading about these things, you're hopefully retaining those sorts of chemical properties and how they work in action. But when you encounter a new example, you're probably Googling it, you're referencing outside materials, you're looking at your lecture notes and sort of constructing an understanding from there. But VR is its own environment. This is 10 to 12 students in a VR room without access to their own notes, without access to the internet, without access to anything really, other than it's just them, their fellow students and the molecule in front of them. A good view of what that looks like is in the picture on the slide. And so they really have to trust themselves and trust their own understanding. And so when they're initially reading about and learning about these amino acids and what they do in lecture, they know that they're going to have to make use of them. And so they're memorizing not for the intent of memorizing, but for the intent of usage. They're able to go into these VR recitations and really demonstrate that they know what's going on, and they're able to apply them later. They can't take notes in VR, they can't reference anything, it's just themselves. So this is, in a way, learning by immersion, to use this language analogy. And that's what translates to future use. And this is not just me talking and having been through it. This is a quantitative thing. And as part of the SOLER study, we found that VR recitation students, this is based on those 2021 trials, performed better on a quiz which tested that sort of spatial understanding of biochemistry relative to the Zoom recitation folks. On to the second point here, which is engagement. Sure, VR can help you learn, but is it something you want to be doing? And I think VR, in addition to being new and cool and innovative and all that sort of stuff, promotes a lot of buy-in. Even toward the time when VR becomes commonplace, I think it'll still promote a lot of buy-in that'll lead to future interest. And the reason for that is pretty simple. VR is just plain fun. You can build these avatars that can look like you. It's sort of like a Wii Sports type of deal. You can have pink hair, purple skin if you want, like one of the students in here. You can wear whatever clothes you're feeling like that day. I can take my students to the beach to learn about biochemistry. We can take it on a mountain, whatever you want. It's really, really fun. To be able to hold a molecule in your hand versus looking at it on a screen is a totally different experience. And it's something that students want to keep doing again and again and again. And a way that I found this out was two things, really. One is when I first started teaching after having taught on Zoom and then taught in VR, I can't describe the way that my students interacted with the material in VR as anything other than childlike. And I mean that in the most positive way. Everyone came in with such joy, such excitement to really play with the material, to be curious about it, as Professor Metcalfe said. So that's been really wonderful to observe. And the second sort of thing that I'd like to touch on here is that students are engaging with the material on their own time too. It's not just that they want to come into class and learn about VR and biochemistry and all that stuff. What I would do sometimes is leave a protein in the VR space. For example, this teal guy up here, and I would say, I'll leave this in this room between now and next week when we have our next recitation. You can come into the VR space and, zoom in, zoom out, rotate it, do whatever you feel like to help you understand. And students would come in voluntarily. And for Columbia students, that's a big ask because we all have a lot on our plate. So they were really having fun with this. And again, this isn't just talk. We have quantitative data on this. Students in the VR group felt markedly more engaged in their learning relative to the Zoom recitation, even comparable to in-person learning. It's really incredible. So now that we know that VR is promoting learning, it's promoting engagement, what's next? How do we actually use VR going forward? Is it these VR recitations? Is there something different we can do? How do we optimize this? And so in order to provide my thoughts on the matter, I'd like to tell you about something that was a complete accident or totally unintentional when I was teaching, which is this big Facebook glitch last semester. If y'all remember, sometime in October 4th, all of Facebook's platforms went down one evening, WhatsApp, Instagram, and that included Oculus, which is the platform that we use for VR. And this was about 20 minutes before my recitation, and I really didn't want to cancel. And so I was stuck here trying to figure out, how am I going to make sure that my students get something out of the hour that I have to teach them something? And so I decided that I was going to do the recitation on Zoom. These 3D structures that we import into VR, they're from something called the Protein Data Bank, which is used by a lot of biologists and has these 3D structures that are most commonly viewed in 2D. You can click around on the screen to put the protein in new orientations and whatnot. And so I pulled up these structures on the Protein Data Bank and showed them to them there, and put the students into breakout rooms like you would be in VR. And then they looked at these structures in 2D. And then the next recitation, the next week, I brought that same molecule back. I said, okay, now we're in 3D. You learned a bit last week in 2D. Let's see if you can get anything more from the VR version of the thing. And without me even asking them, all of my students came back to me and they said, this was really amazing. This was so great. Because in VR, you can feel a little bit lost if you're seeing a molecule for the first time, especially if it's, the first time you're in VR, first time with a molecule. It can be a little intimidating, but to have that sort of gentle immersion, to be in Zoom first, to be able to interact with a molecule on your own time in your own space, and then go into VR and really immerse yourself, that was really valuable for them. So what that says to me, that whatever the future holds, it's not an or VR situation. It shouldn't be Zoom or VR or in-person and VR. It should be Zoom and VR or in-person and VR, or even some sort of augmented reality where we're actually bringing structures into the classroom through holograms or something like that. I know that's in the future through SOLER. So that's really wonderful to think about, how we can really make use of this technology in a new and innovative way that brings curiosity to the students. So all of that is to say, this wouldn't have been possible without all the wonderful folks on the screen. Adam, for sure, Dr. Stockwell, Taruna, my fellow TA, everyone here, really, thank you so much for SOLER funding, for the Emerging Technologies Consortium, and for CTL for having me today. And on one last note, we are having a virtual reality demo during the poster presentation in the library today at 3. So if you want to try on the headset and see what it's like for real, I encourage you to stop by. So with that, Adam, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Arya. I want to also expand a little bit more on that demo that's happening this afternoon at 3 o'clock in Low Library. So the demo will feature, as Arya said, the virtual reality experience in the actual biochemistry virtual classroom, and it will be led by Arya and another TA who taught that class in virtual reality last semester. So a really amazing opportunity to get to see what the VR experience is like, to learn a little bit about biochemistry, and to be guided through the experience by a couple of experts who actually taught the course in virtual reality last semester. So we have about 20 minutes left today. So I want to first thank all of our panelists, and we'll transition now to a Q&A session in which we'll take questions from the audience. So you can enter questions into the Q&A chat window, and we'll take your questions that way. And as we're getting started with those questions coming in, I'll start with a couple of questions that I have in mind for our panelists. I want to start with Professor Metcalfe. Obviously, everyone has the pandemic on their mind still and is thinking about the ways that the pandemic has transformed higher education. What do you think is the impact of the pandemic on SOLER's, or what are the implications of the pandemic on SOLER's function at Columbia and in the higher education landscape more broadly?
Oh, thanks, Adam. My goodness, we were all thrown into this situation where in 1 week, we had to go from teaching in class and seeing our students to teaching on Zoom. And it was very, very difficult and stressful. Fortunately, CTL and to some extent SOLER had really worked out the details in advance for us. So I, for one, found that the transition, since I knew my class already, which was nice to already know the students in your class, the transition was made a lot easier by them. But then we all went into this, we've got to engage our curiosity too, and come up with something that will allow us to deal with and make this valuable. So I think we did a lot of exploring during the last 2 years. And one of the things that happened for me, I immediately started taking sessions because some people had taught online before. And so they were teaching the rest of us all across the country. But one of the things that I had an hour and 40-minute long class, and I went, oh my gosh, I can't teach straight for an hour and 40 minutes. So almost out of sheer expedience, I started doing breakout rooms and little breakout rooms with 4 students. And I'd give them a question because you have to have a question. You can't just go into a breakout room and say, hi, you although that aspect was also really good. But the breakout rooms were terrific. They were, and so I think our goal now is I think we've learned a lot. And we've learned a lot in a situation that was quite novel for most of us. And now I think SOLER is in a position where the kinds of insights that we've all gained, we can bring back to enhance the students' experience, the students' engagement, and the students' learning. So I'm trying to bring the breakout rooms back into in-person teaching, for example, and it makes the classes much more interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think what we've seen is that throughout the pandemic, it's been a period of a lot of experimentation in higher education, and that kind of willingness to experiment is really a prerequisite for doing the research that SOLER can support, right? So faculty are interested in trying new things in the classroom to solve various types of problems, then that is a perfect foundation for conducting a research project that would rigorously assess the impact of those innovations, relative to some other control condition, right? So it really puts us in an environment where we're naturally thinking about what works and what doesn't, which is really the core of SOLER's mission, right? To identify rigorously through quantitative evidence the differences between different types of classroom activities or technologies or other types of approaches. So the pandemic kind of put us in the mindset to do that work.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there of course are many downsides, but the upside is that of necessity, we've triggered our resilience and our creativity, I think.
So a question that just came in the Q&A. I'm intrigued with the concepts of curiosity 1 and 2. Do these typically occur mutually exclusive of each other, or are situations typically a mix of the two? So that question would be for Professor Metcalfe.
Oh, I think they're usually a mix. But I think that the kinds of modeling that we've been doing in trying to understand curiosity has conflated them. And by separating those two processes, we can gain theoretical knowledge on it. One area where I'm particularly interested in the interaction between them is when you have to solve a real problem, like an insight problem, for example, or come up with a new creative solution. Curiosity 1 will funnel you into thinking that you know and using all the resources that you know. But then sometimes often, if you're really in a new territory, you'll be blocked. You won't be able to solve the problem that way. And that's when you have to recruit curiosity too. So that's when, instead of just getting stuck and being able to proceed, if you've got these other resources and you've got this knowledge that you can think outside the box. Okay, we often think of curiosity too in that way. That's when you can make the breakthroughs. So I think they're synergistic, but they're often seen together.
Thank you. Let's take another question from the Q&A. Misha asked, what are some emerging technologies you're most excited about experimenting with in the classroom? I actually want to throw this question to Arya so that she can tell us a little more about something she hinted at the end of her presentation. She talked about the potential for using augmented reality in biochemistry education. Can you tell us a little more about what that might look like and what do you think its utility would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the sort of hindering things about VR, like I mentioned, is the inability to take notes. And I stress the, really great value of not being able to take notes, but obviously notes are very, very important in a student setting. What augmented reality would allow you to do is to really seamlessly work with these molecular models in 3D in the classroom in person. So really giving you the facility to do whatever you need to do in an in-person class, taking notes during the lecture, but also being able to interact with those 3D structures and gain insights from them and really take that 3D spatial understanding and mesh it with what's already great about classroom learning. So I'm very, very excited about the possibility of AR. And the other reason I'm excited about AR is that what we like about VR is that it allows this sort of small group interaction with the 3D molecule. But that's the entire class. And you can do that for an hour and that's great. But what it could look like in person is, okay, let's talk about this paper that involves this molecule. And let's actually bring that molecule into practice. Let's take 10 minutes in a sort of quasi breakout room situation, look at this molecule in 3D with the person next to you, and then come back and let's discuss it as a class. Those sorts of interactions would be much, much easier if we could sort of get rid of that 3D interaction and in-person divide in a sense.
Thanks, Arya. Clearly, it's an exciting future in terms of STEM education with new technologies and the potential that they offer to really experience something that previously existed only in imagination, which I think is actually a huge part of the science learning experience, right? To engage with a world that's not normally accessible to us and is maybe too big or too small or too far in the past for us to directly experience, through in the real world. Let's go to another question from the Q&A for Dr. Barron. With respect to the objective structured clinical examinations, the OSCEs, are you also looking at interactions among students and the standardized patients based on their different racial, gender, and other identities and how it impacts the student's performance?
Yeah, it's a great question. The more we have been discussing this as a group, the wider our lens has become. We're really thinking about what does the standardized patient bring to the table, who they are as a person, what their experiences are, what their background is, how does that impact how they see the student, and how does it interact with what the student's bringing into that room. It's obviously a very complicated algorithm that I think just looking at the data is going to help us understand it a bit more. And hopefully that will translate both into learning for standardized patients and for students about who you are as a person, what you are bringing into the room, and really understanding how that impacts every interaction that we have. So we are really excited to think about it through all those different lenses.
Absolutely. Let's take another question from the Q&A. This one I'll answer myself. So Kim asked, humans vary widely in their spatial thinking ability. Does the VR approach work equally well with students who have high and low spatial abilities, such as mental rotation, penetrative visualization, etc.? So I think to address this question, we should actually go back to something that Professor Metcalfe said at the beginning today, which is that there are two different sort of routes to doing the kind of research that SOLER supports. One is kind of the traditional scholarship of teaching and learning route, where you're a faculty member teaching a class, you have an interesting idea, you've noticed something, and you want to do a research study that will further illuminate the relative merits of one approach versus another, right? The other approach is more theory driven and more psychological framework driven. And I think it's that perspective, the perspective of a cognitive psychologist, that really gets at the question that Kim asked, right? So if we want to know about virtual reality as a tool for learning biochemistry, we might also want to know how its usefulness in that role interacts with different elements of the students' sort of mental characteristics, as Kim suggested, right? How good are they at, are they sort of spatial thinkers? Are they visual learners, et cetera? So by really combining the virtual reality experiments with the perspective of cognitive psychologists, that's how we can maybe go to the next level in understanding exactly how this technology can be used and for what and for whom, right? So I would say that we don't know the answer to this question yet, but it's a really wonderful question because it's one that implies that the real way to get to the next level of understanding with the use of this technology is by joining forces with cognitive psychologists who understand about the various elements of the mental processes that go into learning biochemistry, how they can be abstracted, how they can be measured, represented, and tested, and then combining all of that with the research on the technology and the learning objectives of the course itself. So fusing the cognitive psychology perspective with the scholarship of teaching and learning perspective is a really promising avenue for future work. Another question for Dr. Barron. Could you speak a little about the progress you have made in the way your team has tried to measure and address implicit bias in assessing medical students' clinical skills? It sounds like a very long-term, large-scale project. I wonder how other faculty administrators responded to your project and provide support, and how did the medical students respond?
I would say we're in our early stages of going through this work. Just assembling the team and reviewing the literature has been an enormous effort. So hopefully I can come back next year and kind of update you on where we stand. I would say in general, the support is extremely high. We live in a world where implicit bias affects our students and our learners every day in every interaction that they have. There's a greater awareness of this, a greater understanding of this. So I think if faculty are willing to admit there's a problem, embrace the problem, and dedicate their time and energy and efforts to working to minimizing it, that will be received well by both faculty and students. The students know, they're not surprised to hear that these problems exist. So all we can do is try to move forward. I think really get your data, measure it, look at it, put an eye to it. How are your assessments different in different subgroups of students? And try to understand why that's happening and what can be fixed. Your students are a great resource as well. They can see it happening, they can feel it happening. And if you are vulnerable enough to allow them to express their concerns, I think you can learn a lot from that as well. There's a lot of work to be done. I don't want to diminish that. And obviously it's a lot of hard work that's going to have to be done. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to start. We have to start by admitting there's a problem and measuring that problem. That would be my advice for any faculty who is working with students currently. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that from the students' perspective.
Yeah, what in particular would you love to hear from the student perspective?
How are you thinking about bias in assessments? Are you, you're a woman of color. Like, are you concerned when you're getting assessments and grades that there is implicit bias in them? Like, do you feel able to speak to that? Like, what would you wish would be happening at Columbia if you had your wish?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess from the student seat, it's not something that I or my peers, I feel like, think about enough. We sort of feel like tests are being handed to us, we take them, and then after the fact, it's sort of, oh, I wonder what could have been. but I guess from my chair, it would be, I would really appreciate that kind of constant evaluation of what's going on, constant assessment, constant, thinking on the part of the instructor of how could this be better, soliciting feedback so that, months after the test has happened, I don't find myself thinking, oh, what could have been.
Well, thank you both for your thoughts on that. I think we'll move to maybe one or two final questions. So one that I thought was very interesting, the question says, how has engaging in these projects impacted your relationships with your students and or how you view your learning community? I think this question really gets at something significant, which is that when you are doing research on teaching and learning with your students participating in the study, they are really serving multiple purposes simultaneously, right? They are students in a learning environment. They are sort of entrusted to you as an instructor. However, they're also functioning as research subjects, which can potentially lead to a little bit of a feeling of confusion or complication. So I wanted to ask Arya, since you've actually had the experience of teaching students who were simultaneously involved in a research study, did that dynamic ever complicate things, or did you have it? Were there any conversations about the fact that there was a research study going on during the class? How was that manifested, if at all, in the context of your VR TA session?
Yeah, I would say that it didn't manifest at all, really. I mean, the fact that it was a research study never really came to fruition during the fall 2022 iteration of the course. That said, in the summer 2021 and the fall 2020 iterations of the course, when VR was still very much new, I think the emphasis that this was a trial basis, this is a research study, this is, something that we're just trying to see if it works, that was definitely much more palpable. And so students knew, this is an experiment, really. But by fall 2022, people had heard about the VR experience from older students and, oh, this is great, I really want to do it. And so it became much more like just any old class than a real experiment. But I will say that the VR experience, and this is not a direct answer to the question, I just find it interesting. The VR experience definitely changed my relationship with students, like entirely. I would be walking on campus and a student would say, "Hi, Arya," and I would have no idea who they are because I had only seen their avatar. Or the other sort of interesting thing is VR alters the height of the avatars in the room. And so I'm 5 feet tall, I'm not the tallest. And so it takes the distance from your VR headset to the floor and that translates to your height in person. And so people would be able to see me in person and say, I knew you were short because I saw you were short in VR. So those sorts of things are quite funny and entertaining and sort of things about the way we perceive ourselves and our students in these different sort of classroom environments.
Thanks, Arya. That's really fascinating. I think, we talked earlier about what is the impact of technology, or what's the future of this kind of technology in shaping the student experience. And I think we got a little bit of a sense of that just from that anecdote, right? That maybe what we want is actually a hybrid of VR and in-person experiences, because if things are restricted to the VR environment, maybe something is lost. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to all three of our panelists. Really fantastic presentations and discussion today. I also want to thank Senior Vice Provost Suleiman Kachani, who oversees CTL and SOLER. Amazing support, amazing leadership that enables us to do all that we do. And hope to see you this afternoon in Low Library at 3 o'clock.